Hey, welcome to Compass. I'm Chris, I'm the pastor, and thanks for joining me today. Now, as we get started, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to think about a person in your life who you're close to, someone you love. So, like a friend or a family member. Get that person in your head. Now, I'm going to ask you a question, but before I do, I want us to get real with each other right now. Let's just be real. You have that person in your mind, right? Okay. If you could change one thing about that person, what would it be? If you say nothing, I know you're lying because it may be a big thing or a small thing, but there's definitely a thing. Maybe you would change that they have bad breath sometimes, or you would make them like Taylor Swift more, or maybe you'd make it so they don't fall asleep when you're watching TV together. Don't feel bad. It's okay to want people to be perfect. But the fact is, we're not perfect. We're all imperfect. And because of that, we usually have to split the difference between the things that we can accept in others and the things we can't. So, like, for example, when somebody starts dating, they decide what qualities are okay in a future partner and which qualities aren't. The deal breakers. So, for example, question for you. Would you date someone from the opposite political party? Or someone whose car is a trash hole? Or someone who chewed with their mouth open? Maybe, maybe not. Depends. And this dynamic, it plays out in all our relationships. It plays out in the relationships we don't even get to choose. Another example, would you rather have a coworker who you really like, but is so bad at their job that you have to keep picking up the slack for their bad work? Or would you rather have a coworker who's awesome at what they do, but you don't get along with? How about your kids? Would you rather have your kids clean their room, wash the dishes, and do their own laundry really well and get terrible grades? Or would you rather your kids be ridiculously messy and unhelpful, but have a perfect GPA? We all have certain values that determine what is most and what's least important in the people that we have relationships with. And this same dynamic, it exists in our relationship with God. See, in choosing to love us, He chose to have a relationship with imperfect people. And since we can't be perfect, He also decides what's most important to Him. He has values that determines what things matter the most in our relationship with Him. And as we continue to look at Jesus' confrontation with the Pharisees, we're going to get a clearer picture of what those things are. And we're going to start today in Matthew 23, verse 23. Jesus says, "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites." Okay, let's recap a little bit. Jesus is in the temple where the Pharisees have been just trying their hardest to discredit him and delegitimize his ministry. And after a while, Jesus has just had enough, and he publicly calls the Pharisees hypocrites right to their faces. And as we've discovered, this isn't the hypocrisy of someone's actions just not matching up with their words. That's a thing, but it doesn't appear to be what Jesus is concerned with. The hypocrisy he's confronting is the hypocrisy of religious systems and leaders that hurt people and dishonor God, all while claiming to do it in his name. Now, I encourage you to check out our previous messages if you want to get caught up on what's brought us to this point. But Jesus continues his diatribe against the hypocrisy of the Pharisees here in verse 23. This is what he says. "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore the more important aspects of the law." Now, there are a couple of important things that I want to tease out of all of this and share with you. But first, I think we need to get a clear picture and understanding of what's happening here, what's going on. Now, the Pharisees, they strictly followed the law that was found in the Jewish scriptures, what we call the Old Testament. And Jesus addresses one of these laws here, the law of tithing. Now, a tithe was 10% of whatever people produced that was then given to support the work of the priests and the Levites in the temple. Here's an example of what's written in the law in Leviticus 27:30. 1/10 of the produce of the land, whether grain from the fields or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord and must be set apart to him as holy. So, according to this, whatever a farmer produced, it was subject to the tithe. It was subject to 10% of any food that they produced. It was then given to the temple. This was a tithe that was placed on the produce, so the main thing that was their source of income. So things like wheat, grain, fruit, or vegetables. Now the Pharisees, they did this thing called building fences around the law. They created these even stricter rules to keep from unintentionally breaking the law. So for example, in this case, the tithe was just on a farmer's main crop. But the Pharisees, they expanded that tithe beyond the main crop to whatever grew in their personal herb gardens. Little things like mint, dill, and cumin. They would clip little tiny portions of these plants to make sure that they didn't miss anything. And on the surface, this seems like a good thing, right? I mean, they wanted to make sure they didn't accidentally sin by omission. They were following the law to the letter and beyond. And yet, Jesus said there was something more important than tithing. Let's continue Matthew 23. For you're careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore the more important aspects of the law: justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things. Jesus says, you Pharisees work so hard to follow the smallest details of the law, and that's fine. You should do that, but you're missing something more important than religious practice and purity. And these more important things are justice, mercy, and faith. Jesus exposed the hypocrisy of the Pharisees, that they were dishonoring God while practicing religion in his name. And they did this by focusing on the meticulous exercise of religion while completely missing the more important principles of religion: loving God and loving others. Their overattention to details, it caused them to miss the big picture. They paid so much attention to making sure that their car was in working order. And what they didn't understand is they were driving the wrong direction. And this approach to following God was completely different than Jesus's. See, Jesus focused on top-down obedience. Do the main thing right, and everything else will fall in line. If you pursue justice for the oppressed, offer mercy to the suffering, and continue to put your faith and trust in God, everything else falls into place. That was Jesus's way of religion, top-down obedience. But the Pharisees focused on bottom-up obedience, prioritizing this meticulous concern for the details of the smallest laws over the greater concerns of bringing a just and merciful world into being. And we can understand how they get there. I mean, we all want religion to be practical. We want it to tell us what to do so we can check it off the list. I mean, we can understand writing a tithe check, and we can feel good when it's done. But what does it look like to do justice and mercy? I mean, these are vague and inexhaustible principles that you just can't do and then be done with. This is a wide and inexhaustible task, and it can't be accomplished just with one act. And when we're faced with what seems like an impossible challenge, it's easier to focus on just doing the details of religion well. Getting small things right, it makes us feel good, even when maybe we're not. And this is what blinded the Pharisees to their hypocrisy. But Jesus continues here in verse 24. Blind guides, you strain your water so you won't accidentally swallow a gnat, but you swallow a camel. Now, this may just sound like a funny metaphor that Jesus used. You're so focused on not eating something small that you end up eating something huge. But Jesus is actually saying more here. Look at Leviticus chapter 11:20. It says, and this is Old Testament law too, you must not eat winged insects that walk along the ground. They are detestable to you. If such an animal falls into a clay pot, everything in the pot will be defiled, and the pot must be smashed. If the water from such a container spills on any food, that food will be defiled, and any beverage in such a container will be defiled. Any object on which the carcass of such an animal falls will be defiled. Excuse me. The law here says that eating a bug like a gnat would make you defiled and unclean. And so the Pharisees, they would strain out everything they drank so that they could keep from unintentionally eating bug parts and then being defiled. But do you know what other animal would defile you if you ate it? This one's weird, but look at Leviticus 11:4. You may not, however, eat the following animals that have split hooves or that chew the cud, but not both. The camel chews the cud, but does not have split hooves, so it is ceremonially unclean for you. Now, without getting into all the weird details of that, the important thing here is this, is that Jesus isn't just saying that the Pharisees are missing the forest for the trees. He's saying that in their detailed religious attempts to be pure in small gnat-like ways, that they were defiling themselves in big camel ways. Their misguided attempts at being pure through bottom-up obedience to religious rules actually made them even more impure because they missed the more important things. By focusing on obedience to the smallest letter of the law, they violated the much greater spirit of the law. Justice is more important than tithing. Mercy is more important than keeping unclean sinners at the margins of church life to keep them from defiling us. Trying to meticulously understand and live out the detailed demands of religion, it completely dishonors God when it's not accompanied by the faith that makes loving Him and loving others more important. So I want to distill all this down into three main takeaways. And the first is that some things are more important to God than others. We tend to make every religious expectation equal. It makes things less complicated. It makes things more black and white. Because if some things are more important to God than others, we have to work to understand what those things are. And we have to acknowledge that our pious, detailed, and exacting adherence to religious dogma might actually be dishonoring God and doing the opposite of making us pure. Jesus says, do not neglect the more important things, which means that some things are more important to get right than others. Our second takeaway is that just because something is less important doesn't mean it's unimportant. Yes, we need to make the main things the main things, but Jesus also told the Pharisees that tithing is good. It's just that they shouldn't neglect the more important things while they do it. At the end of the day, moral transformation is still important in the life of Jesus followers. Nailing the more important things, it doesn't absolve us from embracing and obeying Jesus' moral values. It just means that we place them in the context of the more important kingdom issues. Just because something is less important doesn't mean it's not important at all. And finally, this is the big one. Christians should pursue justice, practice mercy, and love God. Pursuing justice, it isn't the seeking of punishment or the prevention of crime. Justice is the elevation and defense of oppressed, marginalized, and defenseless people. Practicing mercy, it isn't just offering leniency to those who don't deserve it. Mercy is caring for those who are hurting, suffering, and can't care for themselves. And loving God isn't just obedience to the letter of the law. Love is a commitment to faithfully honor God with every part of our lives and to faithfully work for the good and for the flourishing of others. God chose to love an imperfect people, and there are a lot of things that can and should change in our lives. But God, in His mercy to us, He's shown us what's more important to Him so that in our imperfection, we can work towards that thing, what matters most. So may we not get so wrapped up in the details of practicing our religion that we miss out on the essential ethics and purpose of the kingdom of God. Not that we become a people who successfully follow religious guidelines, but that we are people who love fiercely and faithfully. And like Jesus, may we know that if we get the more important things right, that the less important things will work themselves out. Maybe you're a person who's emphasized religious practice at the expense of justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Because for you, correct behavior has become the hallmark of the Christian life, while justice and mercy for others is an afterthought. I would invite you to take Jesus' words very seriously so that you don't face the same condemnation the Pharisees did. Don't neglect the more important things. Or maybe you're a person who's neglected moral transformation because you've confused less important for not important. Embracing the more important things of justice, mercy, and faithful love, those things should lead to a transformation in our moral lives and our moral values. Following the way of Jesus will always lead to change. And if you're not seeing that kind of transformation in your life, I invite you to reevaluate your approach to all of this, because it may be that you don't value the more important things either. God chose us, and he shows us what matters most to him so that we can choose it for ourselves. So may we allow Jesus' values to guide what matters most to us. And may we live like Jesus lived, think like he thought, and do what he taught. Thanks for joining me again, and I'll see you next time.